World War II had been raging for 2 years. Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler had conquered much of Europe. But Hitler's ambitions stretched eastward, towards the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. He believed that the Soviet people were racially inferior, ripe for conquest. On June 22, 1941, Hitler unleashed his war machine. 3 million German soldiers, along with troops from Italy, Romania and Hungary, surged across the Soviet border. The invasion, the largest in human history, caught the Soviet Union by surprise. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, had ignored warnings from his own intelligence agencies and from the West. The initial German attack was swift and brutal. German tanks, supported by dive bombers, smashed through Soviet defenses. The Red Army, ill-prepared and poorly led, was routed in the opening weeks of the campaign. The stage was set for a titanic struggle, a clash of ideologies and ambitions that would decide the fate of millions. Operation Barbarossa, named after the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, was intended to be a lightning war, a Blitzkrieg. German forces advanced along 3 main axes: Army Group North towards Leningrad, Army Group Center towards Moscow, and Army Group South towards Ukraine. The initial objectives were to encircle and destroy the Red Army west of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers, capture the Baltic states and Leningrad, and secure the economic resources of Ukraine. The German advance was relentless. The Red Army, caught off guard, was initially overwhelmed. Despite the setbacks, the Soviets fought back with fierce determination. The early weeks of Operation Barbarossa were marked by stunning German victories. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, made rapid progress in Ukraine. At the Battle of Brody, German armoured forces encircled and destroyed 4 Soviet mechanized corps. The Battle of Bialystok-Minsk resulted in the encirclement and destruction of Soviet forces in Belarus. The swiftness and brutality of the German advance shocked the world. As July turned into August, the German advance continued, but the pace began to slow. The Red Army, though still reeling from its early defeats, was beginning to offer stiffer resistance. The Battle of Smolensk, fought between July and September 1941, was the first major Soviet counteroffensive of the war and the first real stumbling block for the German Blitzkrieg. The battle raged for 2 months, a brutal back-and-forth struggle that inflicted heavy casualties on both sides. The Germans, despite facing determined Soviet defenses, eventually captured Smolensk, a key city on the road to Moscow. However, the victory came at a cost. While the Battle of Smolensk raged, Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, continued its advance towards Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city and a major industrial center. By September 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Leningrad, cutting off the city from the rest of the Soviet Union. Thus began the Siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and most brutal sieges in human history. For 900 days, the people of Leningrad endured unimaginable suffering. Trapped within the besieged city, they faced constant bombardment from German artillery and air raids. Food and fuel ran low, and a brutal winter set in. Despite the horrific conditions, the people of Leningrad refused to surrender. The siege would finally be lifted in January 1944, but the scars of that horrific ordeal would remain etched in the city's memory forever. With the capture of Smolensk and the encirclement of Leningrad, Hitler turned his attention back to Moscow. The capture of the Soviet capital, he believed, would deliver a decisive blow to Soviet morale and force a Soviet surrender. In early October 1941, he launched Operation Typhoon, the German assault on Moscow. Initially, the German offensive made good progress. Soviet defenses were breached, and German forces advanced to within miles of the Kremlin. However, as the Germans pushed closer to Moscow, they encountered several formidable obstacles. The Red Army, reinforced with fresh troops from Siberia and the Far East, fought with renewed determination. The weather, too, turned against the Germans. By December 1941, it had become clear that Operation Typhoon had failed. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, bolstered by fresh troops and new equipment, launched a massive counter-offensive in early December 1941, catching the exhausted and ill-prepared German forces by surprise. The Germans, their advance stalled by the weather and fierce Soviet resistance, were ill-equipped for the harsh winter conditions. The Soviet counter-offensive pushed the Germans back from Moscow, inflicting heavy casualties and shattering the myth of German invincibility. The Wehrmacht, which had never experienced defeat before, was now on the defensive. The Blitzkrieg, which had served the Germans so well in the early stages of the war, had ground to a halt. The harsh Russian winter, which had been a crucial factor in Napoleon's defeat in 1812, was now working against Hitler. The war on the Eastern Front had entered a new phase, one in which the Germans would be continually on the back foot. Despite the setbacks of the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Germans launched a new offensive in the summer of 1942. This time their objective was the Caucasus region, rich in oil fields vital to the German war effort. The offensive culminated in the Battle of Stalingrad, a brutal six-month battle for control of the city that bore Stalin's name. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point in the war. The Germans, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, fought street by street, house by house, for control of the city. The Soviets, determined to defend the city that bore their leader's name, fought with incredible ferocity. In February 1943, the German Sixth Army, trapped and surrounded in Stalingrad, surrendered to the Red Army. It was a crushing defeat for the Germans, a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's gamble to conquer the Soviet Union, ended in catastrophic failure. The invasion, which began with such high hopes of a swift victory, had bogged down into a war of attrition for which Germany was ill-prepared. The vast distances of the Soviet Union, the harsh climate, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the Red Army's tenacious defense all contributed to the German defeat. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder, consuming German manpower and resources. The vast majority of German casualties in World War II were suffered on the Eastern Front, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the unforgiving nature of the environment. The war in the East also diverted German resources away from other fronts, contributing to their eventual defeat in North Africa and Western Europe. Operation Barbarossa had a profound impact on the course of World War II. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa, a cautionary tale of ambition and miscalculation, continues to resonate today.